Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Psychological Warfare by Paul M. A. Linebarger. Part 3, Planning and Operations. Chapter 10, Organization for Psychological Warfare.
Big jobs require big organizations. 8 billion leaflets were dropped in the Mediterranean and European theaters of operations alone under General Eisenhower's command. That is enough to have given every man, woman, and child on Earth 4 leaflets. And this figure, large as it is, does not include leaflets dropped in all the other theaters of war by ourselves, our allies, and our enemies. It does not include the B-29 leaflet raids on Japan, in which hundreds of tons of thin paper leaflets were dropped. Huge American newspapers were developed, edited, printed, and delivered to our allies and to enemy troops. One of these, Parachute News, Rakuten, attained a circulation of 2 million copies per run. This was in the Southwest Pacific. In parts of the upper Burmese jungle and the Tibetan borderland, where no newspaper was ever distributed before, the 14th Air Force distributed a Japanese newspaper, Jisei, along with picture sheets for illiterate tribesmen. In getting at the enemy, the United States printed leaflets, cartoons, pamphlets, newspapers, posters, books, magazines. In black operations, enough fabrications were perpetrated to keep the FBI busy for 1,000 years. Movies in all forms, commercial, amateur, all known widths, sound and silent, even lantern slides, went out all over the world. Radio talked on all waves in almost every language and code. Loudspeakers, souvenirs, candy, matches, nylon stockings, pistols you could hide in your mouth, sewing thread, salt, phonograph records, and baby pictures streamed out over the world. Much of this was necessarily waste. In the larger waste of war, it appears almost frugal when taken in relation to the results thought to have been achieved. Every American theater commander, given the choice of using psychological warfare or not, as he chose, did choose to use it. Every major government engaged in the war used psychological warfare, along with a number of assorted private characters, some of whom later founded governments. The sacred government of the Dalai Lama, in Forbidden Lhasa, undertook a neat little maneuver in limited overt propaganda when it printed a brand new set of stamps for presentation to President Roosevelt. The Inner Mongols were propagandized by the Outer Mongols. The Grand Duchy of Luxembourg broadcast against the Reich. Psychological warfare proliferated so much as to change the tone, if not the character, of war. General Eisenhower wrote at the end of the European operations that psychological warfare had developed as a specific and effective weapon of war. The organization of psychological warfare was as much a problem as the operation. It overlapped military, naval, diplomatic, press, entertainment, public relations, police power, espionage, commercial, educational, and subversive operations. Almost every nation involved had extreme difficulty in fitting these new powers and unknown processes into the accepted frame of government, and almost every national solution was different. The British and the Japanese achieved a considerable degree of unification. The Americans, Nazis, and Russians were hampered by the number of competing agencies. The French were burdened through most of the war by an excess of governments. The Chinese did things in their own formal but offhand manner. The Nationalist Party carried on information functions for the Chinese government, while the communist guerrilla authorities carried on functions for the Communist Party. The lower down the echelon, the nearer the armies of the world came to standardizing psychological warfare organization. They did this for the same reason that they all organize into regiments instead of centuries, cohorts, or tribes. Modern war is a self-standardizing process if the enemy experience is to be copied, enemy techniques improved, allied assistance accepted, and military practice kept up to world standards. Psychological warfare units needed printing and radio sections. To service these sections, they all needed intelligence and analysis offices. To distribute their materials, they all needed agents and liaison. Black propaganda organization varied more than did white, but it was amazing to Americans, uncovering Japanese subversive operations units, to see how much the Japanese organization resembled their own. National propaganda organizations. At the national level, the psychological warfare facilities were parts of their national governments. Neither the Axis nor the United Nations developed supranational psychological facilities. The closest thing to international agencies were the American-British coordination facilities under authority of the combined chiefs of staff, along with that mysterious force which in the latter part of the war impelled Russian-occupied countries to sound amazingly much like Moscow. Short of preparing a textbook for political science study, explaining each of the governments and the location of its intelligence and informational functions, it would be impossible to explain in any detail how each of the systems worked. Even between governments having the same general political orientation, the improvised war agencies were different, and in the same government, the practices of World War I were not carried over into World War II. Some description of the American psychological warfare may be warranted, chiefly as a means of showing how a simple task can be accomplished even with intricate and confused organizations, and the Japanese system, on paper, the best of them all, though weak in field operations and control, may be outlined for the sake of contrast. American psychological warfare agencies. The American Army failed to establish its authority and leadership in the field of psychological warfare despite its creation of the Psychological Warfare Branch under G2. In large part, this was a matter of practical politics and of personalities. The United States government as a whole, in the successive administrations of President Roosevelt, acquired tremendous administrative vitality, but at the same time permitted the older constitutional agencies to lose ground to their newly founded rivals. Had an administrative purist and traditionalist been in the White House, instead of a bold governmental experimenter, the logical creation of a psychological warfare facility would have paralleled the later creation of SWNCC, State War Navy Coordinating Committee. From the purely theoretical standpoint, it would have been far sounder to put national policy formulation, White House and Congress, foreign policy formulation, state, strategic propaganda, state, war, navy, into a single administrative entity than to create a new federal agency with improvised procedures, improvised security, and an improvised staff. However, the state, war, and navy departments, at the very opening of our war, were overworked and understaffed. Many of the senior personnel regarded psychological warfare with downright suspicion, and propaganda was regarded as a dirty name for a dirty and ineffectual job. Hence, the old line agencies let pass the opportunity for establishing initial control. Subsequent experience suggests that the use of existing facilities and existing agencies wherever possible instead of new ones imparts stability, discipline, and morale, and lowers the organizational friction common to all new political agencies, especially to instrumentalities in so controversial a field as propaganda. On the chart shown, for instance, it would not have mattered whether the psychological warfare facility, whatever its name, were put for housekeeping purposes under the State, War, Navy Department, or the Office for Emergency Management. The essential requirement would have been to use State Department men for jobs that involved determining foreign policy, military men for tasks of a military nature, and naval for Navy work, and to recruit only after cadres had been established. The sponsorship of psychological warfare by any one, of the old line departments might have slowed down the feverish tempo of reorganizations, quarrels, cabals, internal struggles for power, and clashes with other federal agencies which were so characteristic of OWI and its colleague organizations. Relationships between state, war, and navy were stable, but were frequently bypassed. For example, the Zacharias broadcasts, which were our biggest political warfare experiment, did not go to the State Department until after they had started. Relationships between OSS and other agencies were erratic and cloaked in extraordinary but irregular security. The OWI ran for most purposes as an autonomous group, with occasional reference to state, navy, and war departments. The president, in his individually official capacity, was apt to improvise psychological warfare operations of high importance, without warning his subordinates of what was coming: paper knife made of human Japanese bone, the unconditional surrender formula. The White House staff sometimes worked through channels, sometimes not. The Harvard professor who advised on inflation was simultaneously involved with psychological warfare on continental Asia. The Secretary of the Treasury openly discussed what he would like to do with Germany in terms which the Nazi radio naturally conveyed to its own people. Within the OWI itself, the overseas operation was separated from the domestic, the broadcasters from the planners, the outposts from everybody else during much of the war. But the job was done. Success was not due to the formal structure of the Office of War Information. No administrative formula could have transcended such governmental confusion. It was owing to the fact that all the people just described who went around, with the best will in the world most of the time, minding one another's business, did in the end achieve effective results. The common denominator behind them was not the authority of the president, the discipline of the Democratic Party, or the casually designed, casually overlooked formal lines of authority. The common denominator was American civilization itself. Had we been deeply disunited, this ramshackle structure would have collapsed into chaos. But there was broad concurrence, a sense of cooperativeness, goodwill, and good temper. A German, Russian, or Japanese bureaucrat would have gone mad in the wartime mazes of the federal system. A Chinese would probably have felt very much at home, but would have polished up the titles and honorifics a little. The difference between our governmental organization and that of our enemies lay in the fact that to us the TO were something that could be used when convenient and could, without breach of faith or law, be short-circuited when convenient. Word was passed around, material exchanged, coordination effected in ways which could not be shown on any imaginable chart. It was neither a merit nor a defect, but simply an American way of doing things. This characteristic has the effect, however, of making after-the-fact studies quite unrealistic. There is not much from the formal records and the formal charts which conveys the actual tone of governmental operations in terms of propaganda. Study of World War II organization for the sake of research and planning against possible future war would not be very profitable unless it delved into the concrete experience of individuals. The formal outlines mean nothing. They are positively deceptive unless the actual controls and operations are known. Mr. Warburg makes it plain in his book that he thinks little of Mr. Elmer Davis' conception of his job, but he does not mention that Mr. Sherwood, theoretically Mr. Davis' subordinate, ran foreign operations without much reference to Mr. Davis or to any other part of the federal government. Since Mr. Sherwood was closer to the White House than was Mr. Davis, this important consideration escapes being recorded on the chart. Foreign operations were actually autonomous. Examples of how things really worked, as opposed to how they looked as though they worked, could be multiplied forever. But the soundest way of finding out sober, judicious opinion will necessarily await the writing of autobiographies and memoirs by the people concerned. With these sweeping reservations in mind, it is worth noting the organization of OWI internal. The Domestic Operations Branch can be dismissed with brief mention. It proved to be the object of profound suspicion on the part of many members of Congress, and its function was to stimulate and assist inward media of public information in support of the war effort. The Domestic Operations Branch never superseded other U.S. government informational services, state, agriculture, treasury, war, and so on, so that it was the wartime supplement to the governmental supplement to the regular news and information system, which remained private. This precluded intimate coordination of domestic and overseas propaganda and rendered illusory any hope that domestic propaganda, as eavesdropped by our enemies, could be used as an instrument of war. The Overseas Operations Branch had two basic missions. Within the United States, it was the operating and controlling agency for government-owned or government-leased worldwide shortwave. For actual overseas purposes, it was the rear echelon of both the Navy and Army theater facilities and of its own OWI outposts. The outposts were themselves under OWI for certain purposes. For other purposes, they were subject to the chief of mission, ambassador, minister, or chargé of the U.S. in the foreign country, and still other purposes under the American military commander having local jurisdiction. OWI Delhi, for example, was under the office of the American High Commissioner in India, also under the rear echelon headquarters of the commanding general, United States Army Forces, China-Burma-India Theater, also under OWI New York for supply of its printed materials, most personnel and needed presses, under OWI San Francisco for supply of its wireless news, and under OWI Washington for general policy, hiring and firing, and everything else. In terms of its own global radio, OWI prepared planning and control materials in Washington and relayed these to New York and San Francisco. The radio facilities in these cities then transmitted the material overseas. Through the first 3 years of the war, the precise nature of the Washington controls was in question. Enforcement remained a perplexing problem, and coordination between planning and execution remained unsolved in part. By the spring and summer of 1945, OWI had solved most of these problems, chiefly by means of circulating the Area 1, 2, and 3 chiefs to the operating offices. When personal relations were satisfactory, as in the instance of Mr. Owen Lattimore, chief in OWI San Francisco, Mr. George Taylor, chief of Far East in Washington, and Mr. F.M. Fisher, chief of China Outpost in Chungking, all of them China experts, coordination might be difficult but was never exasperating. In terms of supply, the materials gathered by the other agencies went to the Outpost Service Bureau, which ran a virtual informational Sears Roebuck for the outposts. Foreign demands for American materials were unpredictable. The OWI learned rapidly and effectively, and the material going out of the outpost to foreign audiences very soon reached a high level of quality. Other psychological warfare agencies at the national level were the CIAA, coordinator of, later the Office of Inter-American Affairs, which conducted propaganda exclusively to Latin America and the Caribbean, and the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which serviced the Joint Chiefs of Staff with intelligence and policy materials, and served as a home base for its own units which operated abroad under theater authority. No U.S.-based black propaganda operations were reported to the public. Reduced to the concrete terms of definite policy execution, as opposed to the making of policies that might or might not ever reach their supposed executors, and the routine working of operations, the national level was not important except for the 2 functions stated above, global shortwave and source of supply. The decisive choices were made in the theaters or at the outposts, half the time in ignorance of what Washington policymakers had decided in conclave on that particular topic. When the author was in China, he found that the OWI China outpost decoded its week-to-week propaganda instructions only after they were hopelessly obsolete. They were then filed. The theaters were able to use psychological warfare as and when they pleased. Between the ETO and Washington, close politico-military coordination was possible. Between Washington and the others, it was impracticable. The propaganda branch, attached to G2 as a staff agency and not to Military Intelligence Service as an operating agency, served to carry out the psychological warfare functions of the War Department. The chief of the branch represented the Joint Chiefs of Staff at OWI meetings, along with his Navy confrere. He took care of official messages to the theaters pertaining to psychological warfare matters, and his office itself performed a few limited functions. One of these functions required the author to get up at 4:30 mornings in order to digest the overnight intake of enemy propaganda. He was joined in this by Tehran-born, Columbia-trained Edward K. Murat. It was with real relief that he saw the Nazi stations go off the air. He was then able to pass the early bird business to his Persian colleague. The branch also made up pro-panel studies whenever these were warrantable at the general staff level. The Deputy Chief, Air, was the vestigial remnant of a short-lived Army Air Forces propaganda establishment. He had direct access to the air staff and took care of things having a peculiarly air character. The abbreviations under theaters are explained below, since theater nomenclature for psychological warfare was never standardized. With the termination of hostilities, though it was not the juridical finish of the war, both OSS and OWI were swept out of existence. By executive order of 20th of September 1945, effective 10 days later, OSS was broken up. The scholastic portions were dismembered and reassembled into the Department of State, where they presumably helped collate material for the new Interdepartmental Central Intelligence Group, CIG. The operational parts were handed over to the War Department. For all the author knows, some distressed colonel may have a desk full of fountain pens which explode, transmit radio messages, or can be used for invisible tattooing, along with an edible blotter, a desk telephone, which is really a hand grenade, and a typewriter, which is a demountable motor scooter. Such speculations are delightful topics on which to dwell, but the day of black propaganda is over. Obsolescence reduces all things, even OSS, to absurdity. The OWI perished a more lingering administrative death. It was transferred to the Department of State as an operating unit under the name Interim International Information Service, WWII, and a new Assistant Secretary of State, Mr. William Benton, took over its sponsorship. Later, under the abbreviation OIC, Office of International Information and Cultural Affairs, it was coordinated on January 1st, 1946 with pre-existing State Department offices and with certain leftovers from the Office of Inter-American Affairs, OIAA. It retained the global broadcasts on a limited budget. It still served the surviving outposts, which were being integrated with diplomatic and consular offices overseas. And for Korea, Japan, Germany, Austria, and Venezia Giulia, it acted as the supplying service for the military government information programs in those areas. The Bureau of the Budget took over limited domestic functions when the OWI passed out of independent existence on the 31st of August 1945. The Joho Kyoku. Comparison of this United States system with the Japanese Board of Information, Joho Kyoku, shows the difference between integrated and disparate systems. The Japanese developed a close-knit system which combined public relations of both Army and Navy, all domestic government publishing, complete control of book publishing, magazines, press, radio and film, propaganda intelligence, and overall psychological warfare. The progress of an item through the Japanese psychological warfare system may look intricate when followed on the chart, but it was in fact much less intricate than the comparable American processing of an item. The only aspect of psychological warfare that does not show on the chart is the Japanese political warfare system, by the test of success, the best developed by any belligerent during World War II. The Japanese very early learned the simple rule: political warfare cannot convert a sub-subsistence economy and government into a satisfactory system, but political warfare can convert a subsisting area into one that has the illusions of prosperity and national freedom. To succeed in the face of economic difficulty, political warfare must be shrewd, simple, insistent, and backed up with a touch of terror. The Japanese moved into the western colonial areas of the Far East between 1940 and 1942. Indochina, Malaya, Indonesia, the Philippines, parts of China, Burma, and areas inhabited by substantial Indian minorities. They organized the following independent governments: the Imperial Government of Manchukuo, Federated Autonomous Inner Mongolia, the reorganized National Government of China, superseding earlier puppets, Malay under Japanese military control but promised ultimate independence, the Republic of the Philippines, the Empire of Vietnam, later the Vietnam Republic, a dictatorship in Burma of the Adipati, Republic Indonesia, Azad Hind, Free Indian Government in exile, and the Azad Hind Fauj, Quisling Indian National Army, which put large forces into the field against British-controlled Indian troops and helped to neutralize the entire military potential of India. The independent Kingdom of Cambodia, made independent by telling the helpless king that he need not let the French come back. These Japanese-sponsored governments flew their own flags, had enough troops to help Japan police their home areas, developed psychological warfare facilities with intensive Japanese assistance, and went through all the motions of independence. In 1944, some of them even held an international conference at Tokyo, thanking Japan for liberating all the non-white states and adopting high-sounding resolutions. The Siamese puppet ambassador to this meeting had the unforgettable name of His Excellency, the Honorable Wichit Watakan. Behind the pageantries of Japanese political warfare, economic and social realities were horrid. The Japanese printed money which had far less backing than cigar store coupons. They bankrupted all non-Japanese business so that Japanese carpetbaggers could buy their way in cheap. Businesses owned by white foreigners were expropriated out of hand. They cut off communications, spread terror, raised the price of food, put hospitals out of business, degraded schools, and received the devoted loyalty of large parts of the cheated populations. It did not matter to millions of Burmese whether they had lived well under British rule or not. The British did not let them have their own flag, did not let them send ministers and ambassadors, did not let them run a scow up and down the river with a mortar on it, calling it a navy. The Miranda, the pageantry of politics, was what mattered, not law and order, democracy, security, education, health. The same story might have been repeated on a larger scale throughout the Far East, perhaps ultimately leading to something like Lothrop Stoddard's Old Nightmare, the rising tide of color. Countervening factors included the presence of Chinese agitation, both Kuomintang and communist in leadership, guerrilla operations throughout Southeast Asia, and the ruinous economic effects of American submarine and 14th Air Force anti-shipping operations. Shipping losses drove the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere below subsistence level and created a condition where even the most fanatic patriot realized the disadvantages of the situation. The Japanese put all the captured radios to work. They had traitors of all kinds on their side, including, it is shameful to admit, Americans, Russians, British, Australians, and French. Despite the fact they occupied all of Guam, they never used a single Guamanian traitor testimony to the simple loyalty to the U.S. of the Chamorro people and to the popularity of the long-established U.S. naval government on the island. Japanese psychological warfare failed because the real warfare behind it failed. The Japanese could not whip their over-docile troops into a fighting frenzy without allowing those troops to behave in a way which made deadly enemies for Japan among the peoples she came to liberate. The Japanese did not have sense enough to be satisfied with 100% return per year on their money, but wrecked the conquered economic systems with inflation, poor management, and excess exploitation. Even the Quislings became restless under the poor occupation policies of the Japanese, and before the war was over, a considerable number of the Japanese Quislings re-Quisling back to the United Nations side. Theater, psychological warfare. The Japanese had superlative close-knit psychological warfare staff organization within metropolitan Japan. They possessed many first-class field operators, first among them the true-life mastermind Major General K. Doihara, whose dinner guests often woke up the next morning with bad hangovers and high treason on their consciences. But the Japanese did not have adequate channels of communication, supply, and control between their smooth system at the top and the working propagandists at the bottom. The Kempeitai, military political gendarmerie, structure got in the way. Japanese propaganda lines lost touch with the strategic realities of their slow defeat. They did, instead, what any propaganda system does on the downgrade. They turned to repression instead of counter-propaganda with the inevitable result. In contrast, the American psychological warfare structure included theater operating units, usually called PWB, Psychological Warfare Branch, although it became PWD, Psychological Warfare Division, in SHAEF, and did not grow beyond TPWO, Theater Psychological Warfare Officer, in China Theater. The supreme authority was, of course, the theater commander, on whose responsibility the operation had to be carried out. When propaganda bungled and got into the field of political trouble, it was the theater commander and not the subordinates who took the blame. Every theater was under the command of a general, except for Central Pacific, under Admiral Nimitz, and he used an army colonel as his propaganda chief. In most theaters, the political advisor was the buffer between psychological warfare and the commander himself. In Southwest Pacific, and later the headquarters of the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, Japan, General MacArthur instituted the office of Military Secretary and made this officer responsible for reporting to him personally the developments in the propaganda field. Subject to local variation, the theater agencies faced similar problems. They had to serve in turn as a rear echelon to service the needs of combat propaganda, while working as the actual operating agencies for the bigger radio programs and the preparation of strategic leaflets. As the areas behind them became more consolidated, displays and films took their place beside news and leaflets as chores that had to be performed. Communications facilities were a problem. Purely military facilities could not, of course, be overloaded by the lightly coded transmission of hundreds of thousands of words of political and other news and guidance. The psychological warfare establishments had to jerry-build communications facilities out of what they could borrow from Army or obtain from OWI supplies in the United States, or buy locally. In most theater organizations, the chief was a military man and the staff was partly military and partly civilian. Under General Eisenhower, PWD was not only Army and OWI but included OSS on the American side, along with British partnership, French participation, and other Allied personnel as well. Under General MacArthur, OWI participated under strict Army control. Under General Stilwell, no theater organization as such was set up. The G2, the political advisor or the general himself handled propaganda matters when they turned up. Under General Wedemeyer, there was a theater officer. Under General Sultan, the OWI ran itself. The outpost serviced the theater. Under General Clay, Information Control Service, OMGUS, became an integral part of military control. The same thing happened in General MacArthur's reorganized PWB, an organization termed CIES, Civil Information and Education Section. Had the organization and personnel not only of the American structure, but the usable purged parts of the Jookyoku, obedient to its command and liaison. Other theaters had comparable arrangements, each suited to the theater. The common features of all theater establishments were 1. Liaison or control from Army, State, and OWI, sometimes including OSS. 2. Responsibility to the theater commander. 3. Direct operation of strategic radio. 4. Preparation of strategic leaflets and sometimes of tactical leaflets as well. 5. Use of local, native, or allied personnel. Within the theater staffs, the psychological warfare facilities were to a great extent assimilated for control and movement of personnel, supply, and so on. The G3s and G4s of the theaters normally serviced the PWBs along with the rest of their work. The OWI and other civilian persons were put into uniform and given simulated rank, sometimes wildly disproportionate to their Army counterparts. The Army G2s naturally worked with the PWB intelligence facilities. In some theaters, the G2 was ex officio the Chief of Psychological Warfare, as was the Assistant Chief of Staff G2, War Department General Staff, himself at home. G1s usually kept out of the way of psychological warfare, and the housekeeping of the units was in most cases autonomous. Responsibility for financing psychological warfare was never established as doctrine. The State Department kept most of it off its budget, leaving the actual payments up to the War Department and the OWI to figure out. Oftentimes, this resulted in a curious sort of neo-capitalism within the U.S.-owned socialism of the Army. The two agencies would hold on to property as though it were private property, on the basis of immediate title, without reference to the plain fact that all of it was paid for in the end by the United States Treasurer. OWI once murmured threateningly about bringing its radio material home from Manila rather than let General MacArthur's people hijack it. Such talk ended when the material was declared surplus or stolen. Field operations. Field operations were most highly developed in the Mediterranean and European theaters of operation. Combat propaganda units came into being, carrying fully equipped mobile radio stations and high-volume printing presses along with them. Later, under SHAEF, these units developed further and Army-level organizations were set up which duplicated the theater organizations on a reduced scale. The tactical leaflet came into its own with such units. It was possible to develop high-speed routines for using intelligence swiftly. Maps were dropped on the enemy in unfavorable situations. Order of battle became highly important for psychological warfare purposes, when enemy units could be addressed by their proper unit designation or by the name of their commanders. Intelligence was brought into play. Bad food, bad supply, poor command, or mishandling of enemy forces in any way brought prompt propaganda comment. Radio was the least useful for tactical operations simply because enemy troops do not carry private portable radio sets around with them. Radio was of high value in consolidation operations, passing along instructions to liberated populations, and telling civilians in the line of approach about measures which they could take for the common benefit of themselves and of the Allies. A constant problem, never completely ironed out, was the use of airplanes for dropping purposes. The leaflet producers had, in all theaters, a tendency to prepare excellent leaflets, bail them, and send them along to the airfields in the expectation that an overworked, unindoctrinated Air Force staff would automatically pick up the leaflets, develop dropping mechanisms, pack the leaflets into planes, take them out, and drop them to the right language groups at the right time in the right place. This was, of course, as absurd from the aviators' side as it was, to the civilians, to let their brain children accumulate in hangars or warehouses. For strategic droppings, systematic arrangements could be made through proper official channels, and a regular air operation detailed to do the job. Tactical dropping did not allow enough time for elaborate staff work in each instance, and recourse was had to psychological warfare liaison officers, either Army officers or civilians with the approximate status of tech rep, technical representative, a familiar sight on World War II airfields, to get in touch with the units, help them install dropping facilities, explain the leaflets to the actual pilots and bombardiers, and thus obtain a high degree of cooperation. In almost every theater, this policy succeeded, and a wide variety of leaflet bombs, leaflet dispensers, and other leaflet circulating gadgets was developed. Artillery distribution also played a significant part. For frontline situations, artillery could do the job better than planes without risking aircraft in a quasi-combat operation. Leaflet bombs of considerable scope appeared and could be made to fit almost any appropriate weapon. Circulation was also affected by means of clandestine operations to friendly civilians, frequently combined with airdrop of weapons, medicine, and other essentials. The organization of all these new functions has changed military organization. A whole new series of units were attached in echelon, each fitted to the appropriate level for its work. The rear area functions and strategic propaganda work always required a considerable proportion of civilian aid, since some of the best workers in this line were persons who either did not wish to join the Army or whom the Army did not wish to have join it. These psychological warfare organizations were unbelievably cheap, even if measured by the most conservative estimates of their success. It is impossible that the Army of the future, whether American or foreign, will overlook this source of assistance. Psychological warfare nowhere replaced combat, but it made the impact of combat on the enemy more effective.
This concludes today's reading of Psychological Warfare by Paul M. A. Linebarger. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.